She has left us. Success. I have the most creepy notification up here. It says your phone battery is less than 20%. I don't know how it knows.
That's that's actually it's right, but that's weird.
Ah, it says I should tell you to plug it in so the session does not end.
Yeah, it's plugged in. It's plugged in.
Ah,
You are doing
this is the
advertisement
most
for
creepy
Riverside.
thing. Okay. All right, Che, we're ready for you. CSA, can you hear us?
Raymond, I think you should go tell like whoever in the on WhatsApp. Let's know what to do. Like time they go.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Sorry.
We don't have to wait for the swing to come. We can just start while the swing comes now. They no go break already, so why would they
No, the
stress
swing
am?
is already here. It is Chia that we are waiting for.
Oh, TSA. Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, he left. That's crazy shit. I think what I'll ask the chair to do is to. Okay, so chair says he can't join. So what I'll do is I'll send him the YouTube link and he'll watch us on YouTube and then we'll debate here. Is that fine?
Yeah, so long as he hears us, I guess.
So just confirm that. All right, so Stacy, can you speak and confirm that you can moderate the round on your own?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. So I'm just waiting for TSA to confirm that he has joined on YouTube. All right, Stacy, we are good to go. Please get us started right away. We are tired.
Okay. OG, are you here? Is OG here?
Yeah, success is here. We can start, please.
Okay. Ready when you are ready.
Please can you give me 2 seconds to contact my partner? He's supposed to be the first speaker. I don't know why he's not on the call.
I think I'm on the call. Can you hear me?
You are we
Wait,
can hear you.
this Sussex, like, is you and your partner clowning us? Like, when are they clown also? Like, you should see your partner.
No, his partner is here now. You know, go open your camera.
Okay.
All right. So,
Yeah. Let me set up my timer and I can start. Okay. For POIs, just ask POI. I'm going to take one POI. Okay. This thing keeps showing reconnecting. Let me just be sure I'm still audible.
You're
you are audible,
audible.
senior man. You are audible, senior man.
You're no longer audible.
He's no longer on the call. This is crazy.
Okay, now.
Success, can you
The
IoT?
problem is you're trying to introduce technology to African people. This is
Um,
insane.
let me prepare. Can someone is unmuted? Okay, yeah. If he doesn't join in like the next 30 seconds, I'm just going to iron, or I'm just going to speak. He's going to give a second speech. If you give me hello.
30 seconds as well.
Okay. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe proxy militias is something that like we ultimately like know about, but then the second thing is we believe proxy militias, as per the motion, says they often are individuals that are locals, and in rare scenarios they are often individuals that maybe are international, maybe hired by things like foreign bodies in order for them to fight things like proximate war and whatnot. But then the main question that this debate seeks to answer is, in a world after conflict, should we allow these individuals to engage within the political systems of these particular countries, or should we let them go in order for them to most likely fight wars for every other country and have access to every other resources that exist within society and every other country? Yeah, and I think we are going to have justification in 4 bases here, which is simple. Yeah, I think the first justification for why we believe these individuals should exist within post-conflict states and should be engaged within the political system of that state is based on the way they function. Yeah, the issue is this. Yeah, number one, oftentimes during war, things like intelligence are things that are most likely being shared. Things like intelligence, things like weaponry, and several other things, fundings and whatnot, are things that are being shared. But then the problem is these things are usually very crucial to national security, i.e., you give a militia a certain set of information in which it like you don't know how often they are most likely going to turn back to fight against you. But then the second thing is that they often listen to things like guns and like sponsors, and rather than saying, oh, we want to hold you accountable for your actions and all, it means it is necessarily very hard to hold these guys accountable due to their nature and due to their volatility. The problem then becomes, one, is that when this particular war ends, yeah, the power structure is something that usually don't end. It means that even after post-conflict, what happens is that these individuals oftentimes hold on to power due to things like having things like heavy military presence, or like having things like having things like resources or access to certain national information. It becomes very problematic for countries in certain ways. Number one is that your national security is due to things like intelligence leaking, or there's a probable cause in which like your intelligence might be leaked. The reason why it is even much more problematic is that this particular point in time, they're most likely going to be hired by any other country, or they are most likely going to be left to roam free. It means the only way you can hold them accountable is when you actively have to fight wars against them or have to hunt them down in order to kill them and what's not in these particular scenarios. But the reason why that is even detrimental in its nature is that these countries are often countries that are just living war. It means it is very, very hard for you to carry out or to curate most of these particular things, or create mechanisms to keep them in check within this particular system. It means then that you are most likely at a risk, or you don't have the legitimate power to fight against them. This is the reason why we believe individuals or like PMs should be allowed to like exist within the local military structures, that like not local military structures, but at least engage within the political structures or the economic structures or whatnot within the particular systems in which they fight war for. But I think the second piece of justification is based on accountability metric here, and I think it's simple. The only answer to guns and sponsors, it means it is very, very hard to keep them accountable in most scenarios for their actions, given the fact that it's not, maybe they don't get like a job immediately or after that. It means they are led to roam free, maybe with things like guns and whatnot, but then with things like access to certain information. The accountability structures that are held that is supposed to bound them is something that is very detrimental. But at the point where you're able to incorporate them within the national system, it becomes very easy for you to hold them accountable due to things like political power, or things like the media, being able to weaponize the media to hold them necessarily accountable and whatnot, or due to things like being able to like control the narrative that surrounds these guys and how they are able to influence this particular thing. But then the reason why that in itself is something that is ultimately functional is based on their particular system. Yeah, the system that often exists within post militias is that like proxy militias is that they often like the subordinates often listen to their leaders. It means if you most likely put their leaders in a point of power, they are most likely going to follow their leaders in order to like maybe engage within this particular system or engage within this political system and whatnot. But I believe this political system is something that is much more enticing, because at the point where most likely the incentive that they have to fight most of these wars are things like call for money and whatnot, we're engaging within political system is a place where maybe they are able to see at least a metric of money, or where they are able to influence them. It means one, they're able to utilize their volatility and use it for a change within the particular systems that exist within this particular country. But then two, you're able to keep them in check using the tools for power and whatnot that you're able to maintain within these particular systems and whatnot. I believe that in itself is something that is very, very very, very beneficial to this particular state. But then lastly, why do we think these individuals should still exist within this particular system even after they've opted out? And this is in scenarios where these individuals are often within this particular state. They often have things like local powers, i.e., the certain things like militias, or like militias that exist in DR Congo and whatnot, that often exhibit things like high level of influences within citizens those citizens that are within those locality and whatnot. But then two, helping these countries win war, helping these countries come out from things like post-conflicts often gives them the amount of like recognition that is most likely very, very important within this particular state, or that is very, very crucial. Why do we think ultimately states should weaponize this particular thing in order to make things like successes? It's two things, yeah. And I think the first thing is how this particular system often is beneficial to these guys, yeah. At the point where they are able to maintain things like local power or local influence, it means individuals are willing to listen to them, or individuals are able to engage with them like specifically based on their local influence within those particular systems or within those particular states. It becomes much more beneficial because it means they are one of the people that are able to easily maximize change, rather than an individual most likely that say, oh, you didn't actively fight the war and you didn't actively participate within this war, so why do we have to follow you, given the fact that you're just a random politician? But at the point where they know that you fought for their struggles, or you're someone that has necessarily engaged in war for them, regardless of whether it be for money, if the locals there are willing to follow you or are willing to buy into your influence, and you're able to make things like structural changes after the post-conflict. But then the second thing based on analysis there is how government is easily able to utilize them in order to make things like security metrics or security measures in this particular place. And this is very simple. Notice that after things like post-conflicts here, these individuals are trained like countries are necessarily strained, or country like military are necessarily tight, like are necessarily like reduced in large majority of instances. But then these individuals that most likely exist within the state possesses things like militarized power that is necessary for countries to function, or within this particular state to function, and it's something that they most likely need within this particular system. The reason why this is important is that the point where you're able to engage them within the socio-political systems of this particular country, it means you're able to try and incorporate them within things like security agencies, and having these guys to actively participate for you in doing things like fighting wars and whatnot, and you're able to get this types of legitimacy we are proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Leader of Opposition. Do we have the Leader of Opposition here?
Chair, give me a sec. Let me try to get across.
Guys, am I audible? Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
you're audible.
Yeah, sorry. I got locked out. Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Madam Speaker, Mr. Chair, in the reconciliation of Iraq and the nation building that happened post the war in Israel, with Hezbollah and the emergence of all the other groups in militia in Lebanon, when they wanted to do the reconciliation, they didn't need the leaders of Hezbollah to come and share the representation of the local identities that were there. The people that were put forth are individuals that are technocrats, individuals that are diplomats, individuals that knows what it means to want to build a nation and have that particular national identity. Because what you don't want in a post-conflict society is to have, a representation of violence as part of your national identity. And these people, these guys, these leaders of the militia groups are the representation of the violence that have for so long harmed those particular societies in and of themselves. Having them at the top of the power or in politics or in government, one is morally reprehensible, but above that does not do good for nation building at the end of the day. In fact, we think that it oftentimes creates an unsustainable society in the long run. I'm going to use Syria as an example in a bit. But let's talk to you about a little bit of things. OG in this particular debate have not really done anything because their fear is that these guys are still going to have military and all of that. There are two different stakeholders in this debate when it comes to militia. You have those ones that are local groups in so for example, Hezbollah, for example, Ansar-ud-Din in Iraq. These individuals, during amalgamation and reconciliation, oftentimes what they do is that they relapse back and form like militia groups under the national identity. So it's not that they continue to fight at the end of the day. They already have those sort of representation that doesn't require them fighting. So their goals are often, to resist imperialism, just like how Hezbollah is just existing to repel Israel or something like that. They do not necessarily have those particular incentives, because notice the reason why these guys are fighting are because of their nation in the first instance. But there are other types of militia groups in this particular debate, and which, by the way, I think is more apparent in this debate, are like ISIS and Al Qaeda and Al Shabaab. These guys are people that have fundamentalist ideology. They are not loyal to the state. They do not give a fuck about the reconciliation or what is good. They are just tools for disorderliness and tools for instability. These guys too are part of the individuals, by the way, that are being sponsored by all of those particular international terrorists, and they are the ones that we call the proxies, right? These individuals are individuals that doesn't do good for the nation. So it really doesn't make sense to say that the individuals that are going to ruin your countries should be the one that should be at the helm of affairs ultimately. There are two things I'm going to prove to you. One, I'm going to show you why deontologically this is wrong. And secondly, I'm going to explain to you what state building is and why these guys are bad for it. So first of all, let's talk about the deontology. We think it's immoral for two reasons. One, particularly the proxies, guys, all these Al Shabaab, Al Qaeda, and ISIS, etc. These guys have killed a lot of people, right? Like these guys are guys that their leaders are guys that should be jailed, like after war. They are guys that they should be in prison. These are individuals that indoctrinate children and make them suicide bombers. These are individuals that behead people on live stream and post it so that they can spread fear in society, guys. These are individuals that are sanctioned minor and large-scale genocide within those particular local communities. It's just stupid to say that it's still the same guys that are going to be the leaders and that are going to be part of the government within those particular societies. Like it's beyond like immorality in this particular regard. Right? These guys are people. These guys are not individuals that should go near anything called reconciliation because there's absolutely no reasons why anybody will want to concede. Like all those other communities that have suffered at their hands want to concede to those particular individuals and form a state with them. Secondly, it is immoral because they don't particularly fight for the good or the betterment of the country. Notice the distinction that I've done in terms of those ISIS and all. But even those individuals that fought for the liberation of their own identity groups within those particular society, for example, Hezbollah, etc., right? These guys are guys that do not represent what national identity means. Therefore, they are not good representation of being part of the national affairs in and of itself. So in those particular instances, I don't think anybody can lie here and say that, oh, they are not diplomats, they are not good individuals, smart, educated individuals that can represent those particular identity groups. It has to be the leaders of these particular individuals at the end of the day. Also notice, this debate is not about profiling solutions. It's a belief motion. We are just here to tell you why it is bad for them to do that. The next thing to talk about is what is state reconciliation or state reconstruction and why these guys are bad for it. Right? There are two things when you want to rebuild a nation. First of all, you want to do this for people within the notion of those particular societies to come back together, to have a reconciliatory amalgamation post-conflict. But secondly, you want to chart a national identity that can be a path towards the aspiration of the future that they want to have for themselves. Why is these leaders of this particular group then bad to be put here, right? Because it will not allow for reconciliation to happen in the first instance. One, notice that they oftentimes have struck and killed and targeted members of other individuals, and they are the representation of the hate of other minority groups within those particular societies. Like literally seeing them as part of the central government is literally going to make a lot of individuals pull out. There's a reason why Jews, Christians, and Kurds in Syria right now do not want to have anything to do with the main government of Syria, and they are still killing each other right now because it's this motherfucker, Tahrir, what the fuck is name? This Al Shabaab, Al Qaeda guy. Is the one that is their prime minister. Like nobody wants to be under that kind of government. Before I move on, any POI. Sure.
So simple POI. What you are saying is that the people who should constitute the leadership of any government must be people who have not committed war crimes or any other form of atrocities.
In the best case of scenario, yes. But this particular debate is about particular individuals. We can have another debate about some individuals that have committed some form of war crimes in other diplomatic means. I don't give a fuck. This guy should not be part of it, right? Don't try to do correlation and regression here. Nonsense. Anyways, so we don't think that they'll be able to create that particular correlation in terms of creating that particular chart, right? Secondly, the nation building will not be it's not in their best interest. Like, look, it's like imagine having ISIS. These guys are literally just going to be doing the bidding of their sponsors, the bidding of the individuals that funded them to cause destabilization in their country, in their region, in and of itself. They are not any good in and of itself, right? This responds to all of the claims about how you need them for necessity, right? In the reconciliation of countries, you have people that can do this, technocratic individuals that can do this. We are not here to propose solution. We are just proving to you that these guys are not good to be there. They should probably be in jail or sitting at home. Very proud to.
Thank the leader of opposition for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I confirm I'm audible? I don't know. My network has been very messy. Can you see me? I can't even see myself. Am I audible?
We can't see you, but you're audible.
Yes, you are.
Look, I'm going to turn off my network, my camera, because yeah. Okay, I'm going to start now in three. I'm going to start now in 3, 2, 1. I think if there is anything we concede from opening government is to say that these particular military groups have probably done lots of like war crimes and all of those things that you get from LO. But I think that beyond whatever thing that we are arguing in this particular debate, is the question boils down to in what world are these particular state reconstruction policies going to work out at the end of the day? Because what Temini basically explains to you is what the capacity of these particular individuals looks like, and why in terms of principle it then becomes very important that you ultimately allow them for them to engage in this particular state reconstruction by giving them like political power. I think a couple of things to respond to opening opposition. I think that first, when opening opposition says that these particular individuals have like multiple interests that do not like align to what the state looks like, I think at the end of the day, even if we agree that their interests are not aligned with that of the state, the question is, if you exclude them, how then do you ensure mechanisms that do not allow for like repeat of those violence that have even happened in the first instance? Temini tells you in his speech that when you give this particular individual this particular political power, it means that you are then able to realign their interest to what the state wants at that point in time. But I think that secondly, because these particular leaders ultimately engage those who are under them, their subordinates and all of those things, they're now able to do things like give them command, not to like engage in those particular post-war violence and all of those things, which basically like stop the state activities from being able to like progress at that point in time. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what you get from impact test of our own side is that you are able to use this particular individual to deter the actions of their subordinates, which is not something that you get from the side of opening opposition. Because if we agree that they have like other interests at the end of the day, we also have to agree that these particular interests are still going to play out in a world where there is nothing like to conflate that particular interest that they have. But I think that the second thing here is that they talk about the moral reprehensible nature of this particular thing. I think even if we agree that these particular individuals have caused harm or killed people, I think it becomes morally unfair for us to allow a mechanism that even allows for like an extension of violence on these individuals who have suffered violence in the first instance. Because the early analysis I've given to you proves that these particular individuals still have an incentive to want to like attack the state, insofar as they say that their interests are not aligned with the state. It means if you don't like bring them to the table to like make them want to have the state interest in mind in the first instance, you're going to like allow for more harm on these particular individuals who have even suffered in the first instance. So it then means that the world of open opposition becomes like the one that is like more morally reprehensible at that point in time. I think the next thing to engage here is on the idea of state reconstruction. And this is very important because you can reconstruct the way you can reconstruct a state is when the state actors have the capacity to do so and have like the trust of the individuals who exist in that particular state to do so. What does the engagement of proxy militias look like within a state? I think that's one. They often have like a level of control within like different places within that particular state. But secondly, because most times they are local or even if they are externally sourced, they often like engage like individuals who are from that particular state. They have like a level of individuals who trust them or who like are willing to support them at that point in time. It then means what an exclusion looks like is that you often in most instances I'll take you later. In most instances, have like dual governance happening in that particular regard. It then becomes very difficult because there is no way the state can now meaningfully like carry out these particular policies or reconstruction processes, insofar as most people within that particular state are treated or like under the control of like these particular private military groups or like rebel groups at that point in time. So at the end of the day, state reconstruction processes like become ultimately flawed because there is no like cohesion that exists in the state for all of these things to happen. Let's take the POI.
Okay. Do you realize that per the motion analysis, there is already an existing internal consensus that peace should happen? So the idea that, oh, well, they wouldn't be willing for peace to happen if you don't include them is very ridiculous within this round.
I don't think that the idea is ridiculous, because if we agree that there is an internal consensus for peace to happen, but the case from your own side is to say that these particular individuals do not have the interests of the state at heart, I'm unsure why they are going to allow for that particular peace to exist at that point in time. I think that secondly, given that most of these particular individuals have like a level of interest, reason being why they are fighting in this particular war in the first stage, due to things like exclusion or like ethnic profiling or all of those things, I think it makes sense for you to like make them part of the political class, because at the end of the day, one, you don't only ensure that there is peace and stability that exists at that point in time, but secondly, you allow for their interests to be stuff like represented at that point in time, which means that you prevent like an eruption of another war at that particular regard. I think at the end of the day, your own side of the house does not get that particular peace in the first instance. But then secondly, you have like more mechanisms for like war to or violence to like ensure once again, which ultimately like defeats all of the idea from your own side. Why are we basically like winning this particular debate? I think what Temini explains to you is very clear. The nature of these post-war states are often like very fragile, because little things are able to like trigger off like violence once again. But I think that secondly, there is like a level of massive distrust within like the state's policies and state actions. It then means it becomes like very, very important for you to like hold these particular individuals like in a way that makes them like very, very accountable to the state. I think that what this particularly basic things looks like, I think that's one, when you make them accountable to the state by giving them this political leadership and all of those things, it means that you're able to move them away from their guns and from their sponsors, which reduces the level of like external actors using them to influence things within that particular state for their own like selfish reasons on all of those things, because they have like something else to fall back on, which does not exist on the side of opening opposition and like the whole up bench. But I think that secondly, even when they are like local militias and all of those sort of instances, you are allowing for a mechanism that allows their own interest or their like whatever thing that they have for like reason for them to fight in that particular war in the first instance is being like presented. So you have like a mechanism that ensure that you have like no violence happening in the within that particular regard. I think that second thing here to argue, which like, I've already like explained to you, that beyond like the idea of these particular individuals have caused harm or have killed people, I think the biggest question we have to ask ourselves in this particular debate is in what are we able to get that particular level of stability that we want in a post-war state and allow for a construction process. I think that basically, given that this particular leadership inclusion does not mean that they automatically like become like leaders for a very long period of time, but I think it only like extends for that particular period where that the state wants to reconstruct and become like stable for them to like basically engage in their internal activities and all of those things. Because we basically prove that one, that the alignment of interest ultimately means that there is like lesser risk of violence happening, but secondly, like more representation for these particular individuals at that point in time prior to oppose.
We thank the EPM for that wonderful speech and welcome the DLO to close the debate for the opening half.
Okay, Chair, am I audible? Wait.
You're audible,
Chair, am I? Okay, great. So good afternoon, guys. Merry Christmas. If you want to ask a POI, just unmute once within the course of this speech. I'm looking at my screen, so I can probably see if there is any request. Sorry, let me just get this text from Akorde. So let me okay. Okay, yeah, I'm going to start in let me start a separate timer here. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So Chair, I'm just going to explain why you can't buy the 2 speeches from opening government. The first thing, the only thing you can credit to opening government in terms of impact is that they say, oh well, you need to keep them accountable. There is a problem with that analysis. If a group of individuals are consistently sponsored by a group of armed internationals, either private individuals that have the money and are willing to orchestrate violence, or banks or some other institution that particularly exists, it means that their ability to get access to state power was largely dependent on the formal sponsorship they got in those sort of instances, which means that policies are more likely going to replicate what those former sponsors wanted them to do a priori. But even if you don't believe that is particularly the case, the idea within the motion assumes that there is already some sort of consensus for peace to necessarily happen, which means that the ability of that peace to happen is not contingent on you giving them political rules. What it probably looks like is that they have already laid down arms. They have already been willing for peace to happen. The motion asks or requires you to consider a world whether you should give them political rules in those sort of instances. It's not a motion that makes it dependent on you having peace on the idea of giving them political positions in those sort of instances. I'm going to give you 3 more pieces of analysis. The first thing I'm going to talk about here is why most democratic governments right now have certain rules that say, oh, well, you shouldn't be an ex-convict. The reason why those rules exist is because people construct their identity around the personality of their leaders. What this particularly looks like is that people worship their leaders. That's why votes, that's why things like political manifestos necessarily matter. What this ultimately means is that on their own side, insofar as these individuals have been responsible for the death of thousands of individuals, what happens is that you replicate the trauma and the psychological harm that most individuals have consistently faced under the same set of individuals when they were largely militias in those sort of instances. The reason why this is terrible is because of 2 things. The first is that when people consistently feel some sort of like psychological detachment from the state, it means that their willingness to engage with state policies is literally non-existent, which means that the willingness of people to pay things like taxes, the willingness of people to obey civil rules and regulation is no longer existent in those sort of instances because people don't consider their leaders in the first instance moral, which means that your ability to sustain the rule of law, your ability to take care of people, your ability to conduct economic policies on their own side is greatly handicapped. The reason why this argument is ultimately then important is because the ability of individuals to live a good life is ultimately contingent on the ability of the leaders to control the state and necessarily make policies that individuals are willing to follow through in those sort of instances. The second thing I'm going to explain is why these individuals, because Akorede do talk about this. He talks about why you are less likely going to see why you are more likely going to see a world where violence and where state capture manifests itself. I'm going to explain the mechanism behind that principle. The idea here is that most militias often support certain tribes or certain ethnicities or support certain areas of the country because they want to push for certain things in places like Syria, in places like Iran. The reason why this is ultimately important, it means is because of 2 things. The first is that most of the private support they ultimately get when they were militias was from private individuals that are related or supporting that particular ideology or that particular cause. But secondly, is the financing they get in most instances is from those private individuals. The reason why this is ultimately then important is that you're more likely going to see a replication of policies or making of policies that are more likely going to benefit that particular ethnicity or that particular tribe. The reason why this is ultimately then harmful is that you create a cross-pollination of violence where individuals under other individuals within the state that are not particularly from that region are more likely going to fight against that particular region, and you create the replication of chaos and violence, which means ultimately the pragmatic outcome they push for on their own side is less likely going to manifest. But I think the last thing I'm going to explain here let me just go into the way up. Let's talk about geopolitics here. I think the first thing you have to note about geopolitics is that the way people perceive a state is ultimately tied to the political identity or to the past actions of that particular president. That's why when Donald Trump wanted to get into power the second time, the way people started projecting like the US economy was ultimately dependent on the way like Donald Trump made policies in his first tenure, which means on their own side, people are also more likely going to consider individuals in that specific way. The reason why this is terrible is because of 2 things. The first is that investors and economists are more likely going to project a doom or a gloom for the country, because what it means is that you're having individuals that are terrible or like perpetrators of violence in positions of power, which means when those projections of gloom happen, it means that individuals within international economics are more likely going to bet against the state, which means that you're more likely going to have things like fluctuations in your currency because individuals no longer trust the currency of the state because they don't trust individuals necessarily in control. But the second reason why this is terrible is because when those fluctuations and the increase in things in prices of goods and services ultimately happen. The individuals that have to bear the brunt of all of those things are individuals that are poor, individuals that can't access the basic necessities of life. And I think in principle, this set of individuals are the most important individuals insofar as a priori when like violence will occurring within the state, they don't have access to buy goods and services. When violence stops, you are doing things like reconciliation. So the economics of the state is not stable, which means that their ability to even purchase basic goods and services at that particular point isn't also necessarily assured. All of this explains why, in principle, and also pragmatically, why the state is worse off. But I think then let's just do a couple of way ups here. The first way up I'm going to do is just in terms of the principle. I think by virtue of this being a belief motion, what ultimately matters is the moral calculus behind the action that you want to necessarily take. When individuals' life have consistently been threatened by a group of individuals, should you give them the highest like leadership roles? Should you give them the ability to control the future of a country that they were necessary, or they were the precursors that ultimately made the state to be in that terrible condition? You can't say that you want to repair something when you are ultimately the architect for that particular problem. The incentive and the willingness of people to trust you is literally absent. The second thing here is on pragmatics. I've already explained why economically the state is worse off. Insofar as the ability of individuals to live a good life is ultimately contingent on the economic policies of the state. What happens on their own side is economic doom for most individuals. For all of these reasons,
I would like to thank the DLO for that speech and welcome the member of government to start the debate for the closing hour.
Hi, Chop Chop. Are you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right, sexy. All right. Let me plug my phone in so it doesn't go off on me. I'm keeping my eye on this so you can ask the POI whenever you want. All right, starting now. I think the biggest problem with opening half, I say opening half because OG allowed UU to get away with this, is that they assume that what the motion asks us is a world where these proxy militias and rebel groups have 100% control of this new government post-conflict. I think that that is why their debate is so bad. Because when we think of granting them political roles, the idea is not that, oh, the president, the vice president, it's not that this government just get absorbed into these new militias. It's that they get maybe cabinet appointments, they are members of Congress. It means that what will happen is that even when Mohammed says that, oh, we have all of these technocrats, what will happen is that we have a balance, a mix of technocrats, of these people who they believe are saints and have stellar reputations, mixed alongside with these people who led rebel groups and those kinds of things. I would explain to you why that is important in a moment. But the next thing you have to understand is that opening opposition is significantly uncomparative because they place the biggest burden on the principle, on morality, right? And like, they say that these people are bad people. That's the most hurtful thing they say. Like, that's the most powerful thing to say. These people are bad people. It's immoral to allow them to participate in government. I think that on the weighing of morality, the prevention of harm and the prevention of continued chaos is a higher moral burden than the retribution of people who have committed harm. But the next thing you have to realize is that this state is in post-conflict. It means that the goal is reconstruction. So this is the reality for these people. The first problem they have is that at the end of the day, these rebel groups control large portions of the states. It means that they control several states, several regions. And in those states, it is not just the guys who are armed. It is the members of the population. It is the people who are the old women. Those people believe in them. They believe they are fighting for a cause that is legitimate. What happens in their world is that in this attempt at construction, you have a block of people that literally are loyal to a non-state actor. Unless you are able to sufficiently absorb that non-state actor to give them the legitimacy to say that, oh, we are now part of the state. That is only when that block of the population can now transfer their loyalty back to the state to say, oh, we are answering to the state. But the next thing they say is that we form parasocial relationships with leaders, right? It means that when we see that, oh, the leaders who represent us are a certain thing, then we're not going to buy into them. We say that to an extent where we agree that these parasocial relationships are formed. It means that what is important is that everyone who forms a parasocial relationship is able to find the leader that they want within the active legitimate government. In their world, a large bloc does not, and that leads to less buy-in and all of those kinds of things that they speak about. Right? Jesus Christ. The next thing they tell us, right, and this is probably the most problematic thing, is that they
Raymond, pure.
diagnose, they fail to calm down. They fail to diagnose the biggest problem, right? The first problem here is we can't defeat these people. It means that in a post-conflict situation, the biggest threat to a post-conflict country is not that, people are going to fight wars, right? So we agree that this place does not have conflicts, but it does not mean that conflict will not possibly happen in the future. The patterns that we see is that in these places in the Middle East, in Iraq, what happens is that we get to a post-conflict state and we start rebuilding. And then after 2 years, after 3 years, something happens, and then we go back to the same situation, and new conflicts emanate. In a world where we cannot conclusively end what it is these non-state actors, we're not going to be able to live peacefully. Like it's in their world, when they get to a post-conflict state, they do not address the giant elephant in the room that is these rebel groups. It means that they maybe go underground, they maybe go to jail, whatever. The thing is that they get years and years to consolidate, and then they come back and they pose the same threats again to the state. But even if they don't, we think that the state expects them simply because they have not settled them, quote unquote. What this means is that the state is going to continue to contribute billions or millions of their resources towards preventing the necessity or the possibility that these guys may come back, or that these guys may consolidate, and that these guys may participate in the government in some way. We think that this is inherently a more tense situation for the government, because this is a post-conflict place where they have to be making investments towards infrastructure, towards repairing all of the large-scale harms that have happened to them economically and fiscally. But then instead of that, they're going to be investing in instruments of war, in self-defense mechanisms and those kinds of things. They expect or they fear that these guys may consolidate and come back one day. What happens in our world is that we conclusively end the threat of recidivism or of these things repeating themselves by absorbing and reconciling extensively with these people who have posed the largest amounts of threats to us over the longest period of time. But on the question of morality, we think that in places like Iraq and in Sudan, there is no one actor that can say they have legitimately committed no crimes, right? So when they tell us that, oh, these rebel groups are bad people, we think that even the governments of the day have been responsible for the perpetration of large-scale harms as well. It means that all the war crimes they accuse these rebel groups of, we can literally accuse the Sudanese government. So if their argumentation is that these are no moral actors and do not have the legitimacy to hold positions of power, then they are so-called technocrats. They are so-called leaders, and those people were also significantly responsible in how they interacted with the Western world and how they were able to cause those levels of harm. It means that we think that this debate cannot at the end of the day be about who is more legitimate or who is more morally liable to be the best leader. The debate has to now go and perceive what is the most moral good we can do for the Sudanese or the Iraqi people. And that moral good is keeping them safe and protecting the legitimacy of their institutions of democracy. In our world, we give those institutions legitimacy by ensuring that all those small communities that are loyal to these rebel groups transfer their loyalty to the government, because these rebel groups have been absorbed into the government. But secondly, we prevent the possibility of these harms repeating themselves in the future, and from the government, always standing guard and investing resources towards preventing the possibility of these harms happening. At the end of the day, the team that wins this debate cannot simply just fly a moral argument, because it's uncomparative. Everybody in most of these countries are largely immoral. They are largely bad people. They are all terrible. So this debate cannot be about, oh, this person is bad. This debate is about how do we protect the people who are the victims, the citizens, and how do we ensure and enforce the legitimacy and strength of government. Vote for closing government.
We thank the member of government for that speech and we welcome the member of opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. In case you have pure eyes, you can just unmute and ask within my unprotected time. And with that, I'll start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Two extensions you're going to get from my speech. One is on the idea of where we get better accountability for the most vulnerable actors, and you're going to identify who those are. And then second, and most importantly, why on team government you create a dangerous slippery slope that allows the same problems you talk about on their side of the house to happen in a much more magnified way. The alternative we have on closing operation is simple: is that we should not have these people who have led this post-conflict groups, whatever, to fight being put into positions of leadership. Rather, we should have leaders from these post-conflict states to be the ones put into positions of leadership, and these elections should be mediated by more neutral bodies such as the UN or other like international bodies that can be able to make sure that these elections are done in a more peaceful and just way. Okay, first is on the idea of accountability, and my response is, oh my bad, and my response, this is going to incorporate the response to the idea on the moral clash that you get from the opening half. Within that, leaders who direct these operations are transformative. They transform the countries and maybe they take them from like bad situations. But I think at the same time, they do hurt people. There is no way you're going to tell me that you've been a leader who has not maybe shut down innocent people, who has not maybe caused any innocent harm, and you ought to compensate for the victims. It is condescending people who directed activities that killed their family or destroyed their lives being put on a higher moral pedestal. And worse still, when they come from countries that are not, when they come from external countries. We think the idea of putting these people into positions of leadership is virtue signaling of their infallibility. Because the idea on opening government, on both opening government and closing government, is that for you to be a leader, somehow they make this moral trade-off that for you to be a leader, you have a greater capability of reducing harm. Therefore, we should not really put so much effect on like the moral wrongings that you've had previously. So it becomes difficult for victims to come out for two reasons. One is that the power dynamics do not only suppress but also insulate the perpetrators from receiving any kind of justice, because these perpetrators have no incentive to self-accountability. So when someone has maybe when these people directed activities that killed your family, you cannot come out for justice because the power dynamics protect them and they also stop you from being able to come out. But then secondly, you're also more likely to be forced to rationalize these bad experiences by yourself and others, or but people around you are likely to tell you things like, "Oh, we're already living better lives. Leave that behind. If you are raped by these people who are part of this post-conflict or who are part of these groups that came to fight, let it be after we are living better lives. Just make that trade-off, because that's what you get from opening government. That, oh yeah, we've prevented harm, therefore it is much more important. But there are still victims, and they are living victims who are suffering from the consequences of these things. There are problems, even if you say that maybe they've reduced some, the harms that were caused to these victims stay nevertheless. But what happens is that everyone around you flattens these experiences that you got. Four impacts to this is that one, victims feel terrible because they have no voice for them. They have the least capability to be able to make a comeback from the harm that was done to them when you've had your family killed, when you were raped during the operation, that all that kind of stuff. And they're also the most dependent on the state. But imagine being dependent on a state that constantly invalidates your experience just because the person who committed these crimes against you is in a position of leadership. That is immoral. Secondly, destroys the tenets on which the criminal justice system stands. For example, retribution. We think people should be punished for that, for pursuing violence in any possible. We should not reward them by putting them into positions of leadership. That is immoral. Even if it is people who have committed violence within maybe the post-conflict countries, all those people should be punished. But then thirdly, people lose trust in the system and you unlock a rabbit hole of possible reactionary responses. And this engages the idea from both opening government and closing government on how they eradicate the idea of these things ever happening again. The thing is, these things are more likely to happen because you increase the instant. People are more likely to react in a bad way when they feel like the people who wronged them are just being rewarded by being put into positions of power. Violence becomes worse on government because it is easy for populists to feed into nationalist sentiments and tell the people that, oh, see, America has finally decided to take over our country. The same thing people maybe in the Middle East can tell like the Muslims who live in those countries, that, oh, see, America has finally decided to take over us, therefore we should fight against them. You're more likely to have this nationalist populist sentiment actually inflating the violence team proposition is wanting to go against. But then fourthly, it's also unfair because you snatch the power for self-actualize. They're the victims here. They're not the people who are the victims aren't the people who fought this who fought for the post-conflict countries. The people living within these post-conflict countries. You should give them a choice to be able to self-actualize and be able to determine their fate on their side of the house. You become an overbearing and tell them, no, you don't have the capability to choose right for yourself. We think we are the best people for you, and that in itself is a wrong superiority complex that should not impose on these people. The way in here is simple: that accountability is more likely to happen when you cannot be insulated against it by the authority you have, or the narratives that make it easier for people to rationalize the bad experiences you've done to them. But then, secondly, harm we don't think harm just exists on a non-consequentialist metric like we get from our opening, but it also exists on a consequentialist metric. When we see people who actual victims of these or of the activities of these people that came to fight for the post-conflict countries being able to come out and speak or being able to seek for some form of justice without being pushed behind. And then secondly is on the idea of how it creates a dangerous slippery slope. We think the idea of having to put these people who fought for post conflict who fought for post conflict countries into power is more likely to be weaponized by external actors to take over power for two reasons. Is because one, we think that many times the interventions are based on extremely subjective metrics. For example, American exceptionalism has a specific way it defines feminism. People in America are more likely to see women in Saudi Arabia being as subjugated just because they have to wear these veils and that kind of stuff. Many times the things that they use to be able to self-determine and as tools of empowerment. So what then happens is that when you have this dominant narrative of what exactly democracy is, or of what exactly feminism is, you make it much easier for these external actors to come and intervene in the name of, oh, we are trying to restore democracy, or we are trying to protect women's rights, and that is harmful. And then secondly, even the ulterior motives that most of these external actors could have. For example, control of resources. For example, Rwanda is using M23 to be able to control resources in DRC, or Saudi Arabia using RSF in South Sudan. External actors exacerbate the problems on GAV because these problems are more likely to happen when you give these people validation that, oh, when you cause this chaos, you're going to be rewarded for it by having leaders put into positions of power in those same exact countries where you're trying to solve some problem. You create a path of low resistance to concretize their influence, and therefore you increase their incentives to intervene. And it is a threat to sovereignty of weaker states because they're more likely to be able to protect themselves against these interventions. And we think you make weaker states soft targets of this malicious influence. You make it easier for stronger states to exploit some of the already weaker structures, implant populist and propagate narratives, just like we saw America propagating narratives against what's that guy's name in Libya? I've forgotten what his name was. And putting leaders validates their power and makes it more difficult for it to be challenged.
Time up.
Thank you.
We
Just to be
thank
sure.
the
Okay.
okay. We thank the opposition member for that speech and welcome the government whip to close the debate for the government bench.
Just to be sure, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Good. Starting now. So imagine yourself in a post-conflict society. A lot of people have been raped, a lot of people have been killed, a lot of houses have been damaged, a lot of homes have been splitted, refugee crisis, people fleeing from one place to another, right? A lot of people en masse living in shelters, flooded homes, diseases ravaging everywhere, people dying from dysentery, everywhere smelling because of corpses. There is no such thing as healthcare, no electricity, no water supply, nothing of semblance of a normal life. And CEO said you should do elections. How is that going to work exactly? Like, that is quite uncomparative. First of all, that's not even the way it's like. I don't necessarily think, even if they are swing, they will not break anyway. But intellectually, they are still not breaking because I don't necessarily think they were able to make any sort of meaningful contribution. But secondly, they say you should capture the people who commit this particular crime. Duh. With which justice system, most of the justices are probably dead. All the lawyers have forgotten their certificates. They don't even know where their wigs are. What are you talking about? What crime? Well, secondly, the comparative is not that we can punish these people because in the best case scenario, we want to punish them, right? We actually want to put them in cuffs. We want to make sure they are punished, but we can't do that. In this particular debate, there is two dichotomy. First, it's either like we do everything we say we want to do, that's putting them in, in political roles. But secondly, or we just let them go and fight war elsewhere, right? And that is the debate. CO is out of this debate because they have no meaningful contribution. Or any other thing that I did not engage from CO is a contextual, but secondly, it's inhumane. If you understand the dire situation I paint for you at the start of my speech, it simply means that anything, right, that CEO says, it simply means it's very barbaric and it's not something you should do in those particular regard, because that is not something those particular people in those desperate times actually are able to do. Notice all what CEO says requires privilege, a functioning state, for it to actually work. This state is not functioning. It simply means for their case to work, they first have to first present that this state is going to function from any of their benefits to flow. They've not proven that, they're out. Let's go to opening up. Opening up says, in this dystopic world, what we should do is that we should allow these people to, go to other places, right, and fight war and kill other people there. Notice what the motion says, and this info slide forces them to defend the comparative. The info slide say these people are tools to be redeployed elsewhere to fight war and are going to kill other people. Oftentimes, these people are going to be redeployed in neighboring states. They are going to go to neighboring states to cause another problem. That's literally their modulus operandi. It simply means that if this debate is about morality and about death and about life, basically, on our side, we get a benefit. On our side, we're able to hold these people politically accountable and actually absolve them. On their side, definitely, these people are going to continue killing and doing whatever in elsewhere. They'll probably want to say, oh, it's none of our business since they're killing elsewhere. What? Morality doesn't care or differentiate with nationality when it comes to human life. You shouldn't politicize that. But secondly, is that if it's in neighboring countries, you're going to still have problems like refugee crisis, like spill off wars coming to your places, right? And oftentimes this is very chaotic. But lastly, some wars are actually transcontinental. So let me give you an example. Some example is some language that exists within Rwanda, for example, would still exist in Uganda. If they are killing those people in Uganda, those people in Rwanda would feel threatened and act in violence. It simply means that this kind of violence can spread. In other words, violence still continues. But let's engage OO's case in its true entirety. I don't think that they win on morality, and morality will win. So let's just leave that out of the way. Now, remember the picture I painted for you from the onset of this particular debate, because it's very crucial. Now, what OO say we should do, right, is that we should allow these particular people to live, right? The problem is people are going to constantly live in fear because they know that these particular people are still strong, they still have their arms, and they're going to be always going to live in fear. What is that fear going to do? In a state that need economic miracle, economic recovery, a lot of aid, to battle things like hunger and stuff, they are going to fund all their money in military spending. That's terrible because you literally are going to, people are literally just going to die like for preventable diseases because the government is actually in fear of the terrorists coming back to kill them. So because they don't want to do that, they have to spend all their money in military spending. Their people actually die outrightly. That's terrible. I don't think that's that's a good reconciliation effort. But secondly, I think it slows down reconciliation, right? Because most of the money are going to use to build infrastructure, road, reconnect pipelines and stuff like that. You're using it to get missile ammunition. It simply means that the reconstruction or reconciliation you want to talk about doesn't happen. All the benefit Aristotle talk about economic currency and stuff is what's on their side, because I don't even think they are able to get it. On our side, their harm on our side is that, oh, your national identity is going to be of violence, so some people are not going to invest. On your own side, I don't think people are going to invest at all because of the economy won't even get going in the first place because most of the money will go to economic spending and the rest is probably going to be like buying aid and stuff. So it simply means that on your side, it's definitely hard to get economic recovery. Any PI at this point?
Militia gets absorbed in the military of the state. That's not our burden. But you guys are jumping the mechanization that proves your impact of absorbing this military leader. Like Ray said, they control different regions. No one of them is going to allow another person win in the political tussle of reconciliation. You are literally going to have another Hemiti of Sudan that is fighting another rival war general at the end of the day.
Out of
Perhaps our
order,
side where
out
is
of order.
Thank you. So the fact that he has to say it out of order already tells you that the content of that particular PR literally has no meaning. Anyway, moving on to OG. Look, I don't know what what OG did to offend OO, but they are literally fucked. OO literally screw OG over, because I don't necessarily think that OG made any meaningful contribution also to this particular debate. Because first, I think that OG is able to operate them like I don't know, Christmas chicken or something, and just eat them for lunch. But secondly, I think almost all OG's impact is actually very intuitive, saying that, oh, people are just going to drop their weapon and that's the end. The people are going to drop their weapons on either ways. The question is what happens in the future of these particular countries. Look, at the end of this particular debate is about specific lifelines for the people who are suffering right now, and we win. But secondly, even if we don't win in that, on morality that OJ wants to talk about, given that we know that these people are going to kill people elsewhere, that might also affect us in the future, we still win.
Is it done? Yellow. Hello. Hello.
Is it opposition whip speaking next?
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
So is government whip done? Sorry, I was logged out. Hello? Oh, chim. Hello?
Um, can I continue with my speech as the whip, opposition whip?
Yes, yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. So my speech starts in five, four, three, two, one. Four things I'm going to talk about in my speech. One is on the idea we get from the government about people not being able to be punished at all. Second is on where wars happen much more. Thirdly, on where do you protect the most vulnerable more. And fourthly is on the idea of morality. First is on why they can't be punished. We don't understand why this necessarily is true because we think there are still structures that punish people for crimes. They might not necessarily be within the post-conflict countries, but there are still other international bodies that function to be able to punish people who commit these crimes against humanity. Places like the International Criminal Court. You don't know why those exact systems are less likely to work in our world. They didn't prove that to us. Secondly, is on where do we protect where do wars happen more? Three reasons as to why we think wars are more likely to happen on both government teams. Is you think that the first thing is that when you put these people into positions of leadership, people who have been instituted by external actors, you're more likely to have external actors weaponizing this leverage to have some form of control. Remember, there are already huge incentives for external actors to want to intervene, for example, wanting to control resources and just wanting to inflict some kind of hard power. You lower the barrier of entry and create a path of low resistance for them when you tell them that, oh, when you come and intervene within these countries, even if it's violent, you're going to still have some form of reward by having you by having the system put leaders into power that are going to follow the exact same objectives that you have for these countries. So we don't really see why these people are likely to serve in the best interest of the people of the post-conflict countries. They are more likely to serve in the best interest of the external actors that sent them. An example, we told you about how M23 is being used by Rwanda, or how the RSF in South Sudan is being used by Saudi Arabia to extend the interests of Saudi Arabia, not necessarily serving within the interests of the people living within Sudan. Because when wars continue for a long period of time, they even have a greater justification for them to be put into power, because they'll say things like, you see, these rebels actually bad people, therefore you should allow us to be in power and all that kind of stuff. And that is something they want for themselves. But then secondly, you also create this whole system of people wanting to revenge on systems that rob them of the ability to experience some form of nationalistic feeling. When you tell them that, oh, wars have ended, and guess what? When you appear in a period of turbulence, the person is going to best represent you someone who comes from an external country. That is something which does not sit well with many people. They are more likely to want to retaliate so they can have some form of nationalistic control. People always want to feel like they have control over situations all over the countries in which they exist. When you have someone who has been instituted by an external actor being positioned as a leader, something which does not sit well with many people, it's more likely to be used by police to further concretize the already anti-colonialist ideas they have. We told you about how people in the Middle East are more likely to say things like, oh, you see, the US finally wants to westernize us and rob us of our culture, and therefore they're more likely to gain support from people and form some form of like a violent retaliation against this already instituted power, making the violence that happens on your side much worse. But then thirdly, we think the violence still happens eventually. It's not just a nationalistic sentiment. The fact that these people you've put into positions of leadership have led operations that have hurt people, that have killed people, and somehow you do not want to hold them accountable. You just want them to be put into positions of leadership, or just have them hopping from one country to another like disposable tools. Notice that the people who get to suffer from the consequences, who get to suffer from the implications of the actions of these people are living. They experience these feelings in real time. You're not just going to tell someone who has been raped or who has had their family lost because of these operations to just sit back and deal with it after they are having a better life. They want some form of justice. The reason why the justice is less likely to happen, when you put these people into positions of leadership, you insulate them against that kind of justice, because the narratives that surround them being put into leadership are things like, oh, they are morally better than these other people, therefore we should just let them off the loose. And even then, they have no incentive to be able to hold themselves accountable, because if I'm in a position of leadership, there is no reason as to why I should allow myself to be put into prison or to receive some kind of punishment for the atrocities I've committed, because I don't want to. All human beings have this internal incentive to self-preserve, and that is something which is not alien to these people you're putting into positions of leadership. And then thirdly, on the third clash on why we protect the most vulnerable more, we think, as an extension of where what's happening more, we think that the most vulnerable at least have a chance on our side of the house to be able to redeem themselves in one way or another. We don't tell them things like, oh, the system can't punish them anyways. What you're telling them is that, oh, even after you've been oppressed, we still can do nothing about it. Sit down, deal with it. The system is actively working against you. And this is harmful, because these most vulnerable people are the ones who usually have the greatest who are disproportionately disadvantaged in making a comeback against the harms that are committed against them. When you've lost your family, when you've lost where to stay, it becomes more difficult for you to make a comeback when you also actively disadvantaged in being able to access any form of economy or of upward mobility. At least you should have justice. We don't think we should rob them of the capability of getting the catharsis of seeing the person who committed this atrocity against you being put into jail, but should just allow them to be able to feel good in their own country in which they exist. But then secondly, secondly, they're the ones who are most dependent on the state. They feel bad when the exact state that they're supposed to, when the exact people who they're supposed to hold accountable are the people who they're supposed to lean on the most. They lose trust in the systems, and you lose trust in the system. It becomes difficult for you to cooperate with the systems that have been put into power because you don't see them as genuine. That's why you're more likely to have things like still insurrections happening or more rebellions happening because you don't think the system is serving for you. I can only trust a system or cooperate with the system when I see the system is actively serving for you. But if the system is being instituted by people who committed atrocities against me and I cannot hold them accountable because they are part of the engines that run this system, I feel bad that I'm less likely to cooperate with them. But then thirdly is on the idea of morality. Even if government teams are to argue that all the ideas that you get from opening opposition are very non-consequentialist and somehow there are still people within these specific countries who have committed atrocities and no one is well deserving of getting into positions of leadership, we don't think two wrongs make a right. If there are people within the post-conflict countries that have committed atrocities, they should be punished. The fact that the other people have committed crimes doesn't necessarily make it a proper justification for us not to punish people who are clearly identifiable as perpetrators. But even then, we still think that preserving the criminal justice system by being able to punish people who have committed atrocities against others is also something which is of moral worth and should be credited within C or never been further to oppose. Thank you.
I think the closing of the opposition whip for that speech and bring the debate to an end. Thank you.